Good afternoon and welcome to today's live stream. Thank you for joining the Notre Dame Office of Life and Human Dignity for today's event. My name is Jessica Keating and I am the Program Director of the Office of Life and Human Dignity at the McGrath Institute for Church Life. At the McGrath Institute, we are committed to bringing the intellectual tradition of the church to the modern world. Today's event marks the exciting new launch of a series of resources designed to empower teachers to integrate life and human dignity issues into existing curriculum. These resources can be found at mcgrath.nd.edu/life resources. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Mary O'Callaghan, who is a developmental psychologist and a public policy fellow at the Nicola Center for Ethics and Culture. Dr. O'Callaghan's work focuses on the ethical and policy questions related to individuals with disabilities. Today, she will be presenting on prenatal diagnosis and disability selective abortion.
Thank you, Jess. It is very good to be here today, and I'm very excited to get this course launched on disability selective abortion. As we get older, we often tend to situate our lives in and around historical events, which serve as place markers and give us some frame of reference, especially when the events are personally salient. Because of my field and my own personal experience, I see my life as partially demarcated by events in the history of disability in this country. For example, my son Tommy, who is 7 years old, was born in 11 now, was born in 2007, the watershed year in which prenatal testing for chromosomal disabilities was recommended for all pregnant women by the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, and which also heralded unprecedented technological advances in prenatal screening and diagnosis. I was born 42 years earlier, in July of 1965. In December of that year, a professor of education named Burton Blatt, well respected in the field of disability, asked his friend Fred Kaplan to accompany him on a tour inside 4 institutions for persons with cognitive disabilities in 4 eastern states. Kaplan agreed and went along with a camera hidden in his clothes. The book which resulted from this, A Christmas in Purgatory, is the most scathing indictment of institutionalization in the United States that you'll likely find, and it marked the tipping point at which the field could no longer ignore or tolerate this treatment of individuals with disabilities. Blatt's introduction begins, "There is a hell on earth, and in America there is a special inferno. We were visitors there during Christmas 1965. It continues, "It is difficult for uninvolved people to believe that in our country today, human beings are being treated less humanely, with less care, and under more deplorable conditions than animals. The grainy black and white photos capture the utter physical neglect of humans living in filth and overcrowding, but even more so, the heart-rending social desolation of those deprived of the warmth of ordinary human interactions." Kaplan's photos are accompanied by Blatt's commentary and further captioned by various biblical and literary quotes which move this work beyond a merely factual expose of deplorable conditions to a haunting meditation on man's inhumanity to man. It is difficult to fully convey the effect here without using these photos, but Blatt later remarked that what he saw is the stuff of which nightmares are made. This photo essay was distributed widely to universities, to professors, to advocates for the disabled, and parents all over the United States. Blatt also used it as part of his testimony to the Massachusetts State Legislature in 1966 on the issue of legislative reform of state institutions. Indeed, Blatt was hoping it would lead to widespread, significant reform in our treatment of those with disabilities, that it would be an occasion, as he put it, for all men of goodwill from all walks of life and all professions to sit down at the planning table and seek viable solutions to the issues. This hope that Blatt held out for reform despite the horrors he witnessed is striking, and explained in part by the final chapter of his book, where he describes a fifth institution called the Seaside, which was clean and orderly, where children were educated and adults engaged in meaningful work and recreation outside of the hospital. Blatt refers to this as the promised land, and he proposes it as a model not only of what those with disabilities are capable of with appropriate care, but also of the type of humanity we, as their caretakers, are capable of as well. Blatt captured this feeling of optimism by quoting another colleague. The mentally retarded, and pardon my language here, I use this term as it was used historically in a clinical and very accurate sense, not in a derogatory sense at all. The mentally retarded continue to be the least of the last minority in the United States, the least understood, the most different, the least appreciated. Still, it seems probable that, in the words of Voltaire, their time has come. And in spite of the ignorance and general indifference of the public, the lot of the retarded is looking upward. It would appear that Blatt's hope was well-founded. His work and that of others in the field were the impetus for the deinstitutionalization movement and more generally helped advance the disability rights movement. Beginning in the 60s, a number of legislative measures were enacted, culminating in 1990 with the Americans with Disabilities Act, or ADA, and the case law that followed it. It's worth noting that the language and policies of the ADA and the court decisions surrounding it were not only aimed at ending discrimination, but at changing societal attitudes towards those with disabilities. If the media is an accurate barometer of such attitudes, it would seem that this legislation has been wildly successful. Actors with Down syndrome have been part of popular television series. Children with disabilities are regularly featured in toy and clothing ads. And last year, we seem to have reached the pinnacle of acceptance when it was announced that the 2018 Gerber baby has Down syndrome. It would seem, indeed, that the future is looking up. But let me read you something else that Blatt wrote. This was from a companion essay, an editorial he wrote for his colleagues at the time that Christmas in Purgatory came out. Blatt began his essay talking about what he had learned in working with those with cognitive disabilities, and then he tried to explain how the atrocity of institutionalization could have taken place. And he said, "There is a dark side of every mirror, a side beyond inspection because it is without thought. And while the optimism and pride, the light of our lives is for the gains made in civil rights, for our achievements in mental health, for the concepts of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution," here he's talking about all the achievements in the 60s, he says, "Surely a dark side in the evolution of our civilization in this mid-20th century must be reserved for the deep, unremitting, unrewarding lives of drudgery and pain we inflict upon our institutionalized brothers who are called severely mentally retarded." Over 50 years after this was written, I believe that despite all of the gains we have made in the field of disability, there still exists today a dark side of the mirror, and this is the selective abortion that happens after a diagnosis of disability in utero. I'm sure most of you here have heard the statistics. In this country, although we don't keep good data on this, somewhere between 70 and 90% of infants with Down syndrome are aborted after a definitive diagnosis, for a total of about 3,000 infants with Down syndrome a year. Even though this data, or the data in general, is less available for abortion rates of other disabilities, they're thought to be similar to the abortion rates for Down syndrome. And if the Guttmacher statistics are accurate as to the number of women who cite health problems of the fetus as a primary reason for abortion, we would estimate that at least 27,000 children with some type of health problem or disability are aborted each year in the United States. In European countries and others with even more progressive abortion laws, such as Western Australia and China, abortion rates tend to be even higher, consistently 90% or greater. In countries such as Denmark and Iceland, prenatal diagnosis has been taken to its logical conclusion with the achievement of an almost zero birth rate of children with Down syndrome through abortion. This can hardly seem to be what Blatt had in mind when he quoted that the future of those with cognitive disabilities is looking up. When we look at the long struggle for rights of those with disabilities that arose from horrific maltreatment, when we consider the strong language and policies of disability rights legislation, it's almost incomprehensible to consider that we're at a point when we have moved from denying individuals with disabilities the right to certain aspects of society, right, normal living conditions, family life, education, etc., to denying them the right to live at all, the ultimate form of discrimination. How do we reconcile the rights of and the positive attitudes towards children with disabilities after birth with the testing for an almost wholesale destruction of children with disabilities before they are born? In his dark side of the mirror metaphor, Blatt evokes the idea that evil can flourish because it is hidden, right, on the other side of the mirror, beyond inspection, he says. The evils of institutionalization were hidden behind physical walls, inside dark and mostly decrepit buildings. In part, the reason that selective abortion of children with disabilities can exist today is that it's hidden in plain sight, as it were, behind the guise of medicine. This has occurred to some extent because as much as disability rights advocates have adopted the language and strategies of the civil rights and the women's rights movements, there's a fundamental difference here. With disability, there is in most cases some trait or traits which are thought to be undesirable, which most would agree would be better off if fixed or treated. This doesn't mean that the lives of those with disabilities have less value, or even that the disability may have contributed in positive ways to the person's development. My son's extra 21st chromosome is in every cell of his body. It affects his appearance, his behavior, and personality, such that it's impossible for us to imagine what a cure for him would look like. Our love for him is so bound up with all of these characteristics. And yet, we recognize we would give him better health if we could, because this extra chromosome has also caused some pathologies, a heart defect, feeding problems, visual problems, learning difficulties, which make it more difficult for him to navigate the world. So we acknowledge then a tension here, which isn't present in the struggle for racial equality, for example, a tension between acknowledging the dignity and value of the person on one hand and the person in his entirety, and a sense of, but wouldn't it be better if the disability did not exist on the other? This tension, I think, explains in part how discrimination has come to flourish in obstetric medicine. The convergence of breakthroughs in genetic testing in the 50s and 60s, followed by the legalization of abortion in the 70s, allowed healthcare to turn, wouldn't it be better if the disability didn't exist, into, wouldn't it be better if the person with a disability didn't exist? So ultimately, obstetrics has taken a good, eliminating a person or a serious medical problem, and distorted it into something evil, eliminating a person. And it's perhaps the fact that this evil continues to masquerade as a good that allows so many well-meaning physicians to participate in it and actively encouraging it without, one would hope, realizing the full monstrosity of the act. And it allows parents who would not abort their children in almost any other circumstances to overwhelmingly choose this option. So this discrimination inherent in selective abortion, offered by doctors, accepted by parents, thrives in part because it poses as health care. But public policymakers and bioethicists are not unaware of the ethical problems inherent in killing patients to treat a disease. However, rather than dealing with this ethical dilemma head-on by addressing perhaps whether it's ethical to screen for diseases in utero for which there are no cures, they have instead performed a sort of a bioethical sleight of hand. In what amounts to little more than a parlor trick, they have accomplished this by switching the stated goal of healthcare screening programs from treatment or prevention of disease to the promotion of choice and autonomy, and then further codifying this change in medical guidelines, such as those of the revised 2008 World Health Organization for screening programs. And so, for example, when the state of California came under fire a few years ago for its statewide prenatal screening program, in fact, the only one of its kind in the country, they knew better than to defend it in terms of improving health, or treating disease, which could carry some eugenic overtones, but they instead argue that it ensured options and choices for parents. There is one final and sinister twist in which this discriminatory practice of selective abortion, offered as health care but then defended in terms of autonomy, is further hidden behind the evil of abortion itself. The offense against human life presented by abortion is so grave that sometimes we fail to see that other injustices can coexist with this most grievous one. This is beginning to change, I think. For example, protests of the disposal of human infant remains in trash bins, protesting of the selling of fetal body parts, of unsafe and unsanitary conditions at abortion clinics. These are all ways in which we recognize that abortion has overstepped the unsavory bounds of its legal limits, rather like a wild animal trying to escape its cage. Disability selective abortion is another way in which the practice of abortion has gone far beyond the original intent and limits of Roe v. Wade. In a case involving a late-term abortion ban before the U.S. Supreme Court in 2013, a friend of the court brief filed on behalf of those with disabilities stated, "This court has never endorsed a right to abort children only because they have been detected to have a disability. In Planned Parenthood versus Casey, this court repeatedly premised its reaffirmation of abortion rights in terms of the right to terminate an unintended pregnancy." Roe v. Wade, as gravely wrong as it was never intended to open the door to choosing one particular child over another to discriminate on the basis of physical or cognitive disabilities. And so, in addition to the general harm done by abortion, there are additional harms done here in the practice of selective abortion. Primarily, of course, the injustice of each particular act in which a child is denied life because of a disability, certainly. But this type of abortion also has consequences for the wider community of individuals with disabilities. As one father of a daughter with Down syndrome put it, these abortions say to our children, "Your life is so different that it merits widespread testing to single out those like you for elimination." This is known as the expressivist argument because abortion expresses something about disability. It makes the clear statement that the lives of these children are to be avoided at great cost. In fact, the state of California alone spends at least $118 million annually on prenatal testing. As we talk about the way in which discrimination of individuals with disabilities both hides behind abortion in a sense and is also furthered by it, it's worth pointing out that the legalization of abortion, and even more so the deep political polarization it produced, has had the effect of fracturing disability rights groups. The assault on the dignity and lives of persons with disabilities went relatively unaddressed by the field of disability rights for quite some time, perhaps because prenatal testing was confined to women over 35 until fairly recently, 2007, perhaps because the field was working to secure basic care for those already born. But whatever the reason, we did not even see the scholarly treatment of abortion as a disability rights issue until the year 2000, over 25 years after Roe v. Wade. By the time the field recognized that abortion may be a serious disability rights issue, I believe it was already too late. Deeply held convictions about abortion were so thoroughly entrenched that many advocates in this field were blinded to this deeply discriminatory injustice. This split in the field of disability rights on the issue of abortion has rendered groups which should be powerful advocates for infants with disabilities largely ineffectual. The National Down Syndrome Society, for example, adamantly refuses to take a position on abortion. And so when senior editor Ruth Marcus at the Washington Post wrote a gleefully discriminatory piece last year admitting she would have aborted a child with Down syndrome, the leading U.S. advocacy group for persons with Down syndrome remains silent. The ARC, a longtime advocacy group, is vehemently pro-choice. So much so that I found myself on the opposite side of a debate in an Indiana Senate subcommittee hearing with a local ARC representative who argued against a ban on disability selective abortions on the grounds of the suffering her clients experienced. At the same time, she requested that the use of the term retarded be struck from the proposed legislation, which led a legal scholar and friend of mine to remark, well, let's kill those with disabilities, but by God, let's be nice about it. Certainly, we have reached a crisis point in our advocacy for those with disabilities when we cannot recognize the moral difference between calling an infant with Down syndrome names and killing her. In this way, I think we are in a more difficult place with respect to disabilities than Burton Blatt was 50 years ago. Prenatal testing and abortion are seen as routine health care. The right to abortion is so thoroughly enshrined in the hearts and minds of much of the American public that it's difficult to argue that its further use as a tool for discrimination is doubly reprehensible. Disability advocates, just like the general American public, are themselves deeply divided on the issue. And the photo essay that Blatt found so effective in his day has not proven a useful tool in fighting mainstream abortion. We shy away, right, of using graphic pictures of typical abortions, and they would likely be no help in this case either. But Blatt found hope amidst the evils of institutionalization. He uses the Seaside, the model institution he visited, as an example of this hope. But the true hope for him came from two sources. First, a glimpse he had there in what he called the promised land of the potential of the caretakers of those with disabilities, all of us, right, to treat those with disabilities with compassion and dignity. And second, he found hope in his own unwavering belief in the potential of those with disabilities. And so, too, I see similar sources of hope amidst the ruins of prenatal medicine. Prenatal testing has proven so devastating for infants with disabilities that it's tempting to want to abandon it altogether. But I have seen glimpses of the potential of this field for good, both historically as well as today. For example, one of the most fascinating and little-told stories of prenatal testing is that in its infancy, much testing was oriented towards the health of the child. Three of the leading pioneers in the major diagnostic tools were staunch advocates for the dignified treatment of unborn children. Many of you might be familiar with Jerome Lejeune, who discovered the chromosomal basis of Down syndrome. Not only was he a brilliant scientist, but when he realized that his discovery was going to be used to identify and then target those children in utero with Down syndrome for abortion, he spent the rest of his life fighting for the lives of the children he was trying to cure. And indeed, he was convinced that Down syndrome could be cured very early, ideally even in utero. You might not be as familiar with the life of Ian Donald, a Scottish obstetrician who developed the fetal ultrasound machine with the intent of providing better assessment and care of his young patients. He also vehemently opposed the 1967 Abortion Act in the UK. Another pioneer, Dr. Alfred William Liley, perfected the technique of amniocentesis, not for diagnosis, which would lead to abortion, but for the treatment of Rh incompatibility. He developed a procedure to administer blood transfusions to children in the womb. He later founded the Society for Protection of the Unborn Child in 1970 in New Zealand. These men were outstanding scientists, but they perfected diagnostic tools because they were clinicians first, who cared deeply about their unborn patients and were looking for ways to treat them. 50 years later, I think we are beginning to see interest in pursuing this again. Most of us are familiar with the photos of the first surgery for spina bifida in utero, which occurred 20 years ago. There's a beautiful shot of a hand, right, reaching out of his mother's womb. As groundbreaking as this was, it did not lead, as one might have hoped, to a general consideration of infants diagnosed with congenital anomalies before birth as patients. But in the past 8 years or so, I've seen this starting to begin to change. In 2011, for example, some clinical trials began to explore the efficacy of treatment of some of the cognitive deficits associated with Down syndrome. A researcher who's now at the NIH, Diana Bianchi, extended this research to examine possible treatments for infants with Down syndrome in utero, and she sees treatment as a viable alternative to abortion. Her lab has been experimenting with pharmacological therapies to relieve the oxidative stress seen in the brains of infants with Down syndrome as early as the second trimester and believed to be related to cognitive functioning. This kind of research points to the hope that prenatally diagnosed infants with disabilities can be treated with the dignity accorded to any other patient. And it suggests that it may still be possible to awaken the sleeping giant, which is the moral imagination of physicians in the field of perinatal medicine, an imagination we have seen before in the likes of those like Jerome Lejeune. What I'm going to say next is going to sound paradoxical because I just described how one source of hope lies in physicians realizing the true potential of prenatal diagnosis for the compassionate care of infants with disabilities. But the second reason I have for hope is quite the opposite. I also see ever-increasing signs that the field has begun to recognize the limitations of prenatal diagnosis. Let me elaborate. We need to understand what prenatal diagnosis can do. It can gather information for compassionate care and treatment of the most vulnerable of patients. But we also need to acknowledge what it can't do. Prenatal tests can assess the details of our raw genetic material with ever-increasing precision. But it's entirely outside the province of this field to predict the human heart and soul, to predict human happiness or suffering based on the structure of our DNA. And the physician certainly has no authority for making the most radical claim of all, that a prenatal test will reveal whether it's better for a child to die rather than to live with a certain kind of disability. We live in an era of evidence-based medicine. And slowly, evidence is beginning to refute the claim that certain genotypes are more suited to human happiness and flourishing than others. There is, of course, much anecdotal evidence. Countless families have testified to the goodness of their lives with their loved ones with a disability. In the case of Down syndrome, though, Harvard-trained physician Brian Scottco has worked to compile empirical evidence that confirms this. Large sample studies show that there are more positive effects than negative of living with a child with Down syndrome. And the vast majority, actually over 90% of individuals with Down syndrome and their parents and other family members are happy with their lives. Even in the most serious case of life-limiting disabilities, research shows that parents overwhelmingly choose perinatal hospice, a program which allows them to lovingly carry these fragile infants to term as an alternative to abortion. And these same parents, while certainly grieving the death of their children, report that these lives were sources of gift and joy. And researchers report that they emerge from this experience with greater psychological health and well-being than their counterparts who terminated similar pregnancies. The reason for this, that researchers are finding not just suffering, but happiness, joy even, amidst lives which prenatal testing would predict are too burdensome to bear, stems from the most obvious limitation of prenatal testing, that it cannot, of course, measure the basic human capacity to love and to be loved. And the great irony here is that while bioethicists and healthcare policymakers have been fairly loud in their justifying discriminatory abortions in the name of autonomy and independence, families of children with disabilities who disregard medical advice and carry their children to term are quietly discovering the deeper truth that we are made for interdependence and community, that we can find happiness in totally giving and abandoning our lives to someone else. Like Blatt, then, despite the darkness of this side of the mirror, I am hopeful. Hopeful, certainly, that perinatal medicine can recover its potential for good, for healing and compassionate treatment of the most vulnerable of lives under its care. But even more so, like Blatt, I am hopeful because of the potential of those with disabilities themselves. I believe that even without treatment, these children, with the most unlikely arrangements of genetic material, are sources of great joy. And it is these individuals, like my son, that give me great hope that we have not lost this battle yet, that we can still say that the future of those with disabilities is indeed looking up. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you again to Mary O'Callahan for your presentation and for your work on behalf of those with disabilities. Thank you to our audience for joining us. You can explore these resources and more at mcgrath.nd.edu/life resources. Have a great afternoon.